For more than half a century, the Corvette has stood as a symbol of American confidence. Big engines, bold design, a car built to prove that the United States could compete with, and often dominate, the world's best performance machines. So the idea that a Corvette could be engineered in Japan sounds almost impossible. And yet, buried deep inside General Motors' own history, that's exactly what happened. At a time when Japanese automakers were quietly redefining what quality, reliability, and precision engineering meant, GM was facing an uncomfortable truth. The Corvette was powerful, but it wasn't perfect, and fixing those flaws using traditional American methods wasn't working fast enough. Instead of admitting that publicly, General Motors made a decision that would never appear in a press release. They took Corvette DNA, the chassis philosophy, the performance goals, the spirit of America's sports car, and allowed Japanese engineers to reimagine it behind closed doors. No marketing, no badges, no public acknowledgement. What emerged wasn't meant to replace the Corvette. It wasn't even meant to be seen. Because the problem wasn't that this secret Corvette failed, it was that it succeeded too quietly, too effectively, and in a way that raised questions GM was never prepared to answer. Questions about identity, about pride, and about what happens when the world's best solution doesn't fit the story you've been telling for decades. And once those questions surfaced, there was only one option left: make sure this Corvette never existed. By the late 1980s, General Motors was facing a problem it could no longer ignore. On paper, its cars were competitive. In reality, customers were noticing panel gaps, electrical issues, and inconsistent build quality that Japanese automakers simply did not have. Brands from Japan were proving that performance meant nothing if the car could not survive daily use. Reliability surveys, warranty claims, and buyer loyalty were quietly shifting away from American manufacturers. Inside GM, executives understood the danger. If Japan could build cars that were smoother, tighter, and more dependable, then image alone would not protect the Corvette forever. But publicly admitting that gap was impossible. So instead of copying from a distance, GM chose to study Japan directly, not as a partner and not as a student, but as an observer operating in secrecy. Japan had become the global benchmark for manufacturing discipline, quality control, and long-term durability. And if those principles could be applied to America's most important sports car, the results would reveal something no boardroom presentation ever could. The Corvette became the test. If Japanese engineering could expose its weaknesses and fix them, the implications would extend far beyond one car, inside the company forever, quietly, permanently, internally. Work on the project never looked dramatic from the outside. There were no wild engines, no flared fenders, no headline numbers. Instead, the Japanese engineers focused on details most Corvette owners never talked about. They measured gaps. They adjusted tolerances. They reworked mounting points so panels settled the same way every time. Noise, vibration, and harshness became priorities, not afterthoughts. Steering response was smoothed, not sharpened. Throttle mapping was refined to feel predictable rather than aggressive. To an American performance mindset, this felt backward. The Corvette was supposed to feel raw, alive, and a little intimidating. The Japanese approach removed chaos. The car became calmer, easier to live with, and more consistent at the limit. It didn't feel slower, it felt controlled. Internally, test reports described something unsettling. Drivers were faster not because the car was more powerful, but because it inspired confidence. It behaved the same on lap 1 and lap 10. It started cold. It didn't rattle. It didn't fight the driver. Prototypes circulated quietly between facilities. No press photos, no badges, just data. And that was the most dangerous part, because nothing about the changes looked revolutionary. Anyone could have dismissed them individually, but together they transformed the Corvette into something unfamiliar, not louder, not angrier, just better. It challenged assumptions about what performance really meant, and whether tradition mattered more than results, when the stopwatch, warranty data, and driver feedback all pointed the same direction. And inside General Motors, that realization made people very uncomfortable. Inside Detroit, The problem wasn't discovered on a racetrack or in a press leak or through a rival brand. It appeared quietly in internal comparisons. When the Japanese-influenced Corvette was evaluated alongside the standard production car, it didn't dominate in the way muscle car legends are supposed to. It didn't overwhelm with sound or spectacle. Instead, it exposed something far more unsettling: consistency. Where the mainstream Corvette could feel brilliant one moment and unpredictable the next, this version behaved the same every time. Steering inputs translated cleanly. Braking felt repeatable. The chassis responded without hesitation or drama. Drivers began saying the same thing in different ways. It feels finished. That single word carried weight inside General Motors because it raised questions no one wanted to ask out loud. Why did this Corvette feel more complete than the one built at home? Why were the improvements so obvious once experienced, yet so absent from the production model? The answers were uncomfortable. This car didn't flatter ego. It didn't reward brute force. It rewarded precision. And in doing so, it challenged decades of Corvette mythology built around controlled chaos and American bravado. For some executives, that wasn't progress, it was heresy. If the better Corvette had come from Japanese influence, then the story GM had told for generations began to fracture. The Corvette wasn't just a symbol of performance, it was a symbol of national pride, and pride does not adapt easily. Releasing this version would have meant admitting that refinement mattered as much as power, that discipline mattered more than tradition, that the future of performance might not sound or feel the way America expected it to, and worst of all, it would have proven that the limitations weren't technical, they were cultural. The car didn't embarrass competitors, it embarrassed assumptions, which is why the project quietly stalled. Reports stopped circulating, comparisons ended, the prototypes remained internal, because once something challenges a legend too effectively, the danger isn't failure, it's truth. And that left one question hanging in the air, unanswered. If this Corvette was better in all the ways that mattered, why was it never allowed to exist? By the time the implications were fully understood, the decision was no longer about engineering, it was about survival. Releasing the Japanese-influenced Corvette would have forced General Motors to admit something it had spent decades avoiding, that its most iconic performance car needed outside discipline to become complete. That admission carried consequences. Branding came first. The Corvette wasn't just a product, it was a story GM told the world about American capability. A Corvette refined under Japanese philosophy threatened that narrative. It blurred the line between domestic pride and borrowed excellence, and marketing had no safe way to explain that without weakening the legend. Then there were internal politics. Admitting this version was better meant acknowledging that existing teams, processes, and decisions had fallen short. Careers had been built defending the Corvette's identity. Approving this car would have undone years of internal justification with a single signature. Union optics mattered too. Manufacturing pride, plant loyalty, and domestic labor were inseparable from the Corvette's image. Even hinting that outside methods had produced a superior result risked igniting tensions GM wasn't prepared to manage. But the most dangerous truth was simpler. If this Corvette existed publicly, it would rewrite history. It would prove that refinement was not the enemy of performance, that reliability wasn't optional, that the limitations holding the Corvette back were never about resources or talent, but about mindset. And once that door opened, it couldn't be closed again. So the project wasn't cancelled with fanfare, it wasn't labelled a failure, it was quietly dissolved. Test data archived, prototypes reassigned, lessons absorbed without attribution. Officially, nothing happened. Unofficially, GM protected the myth, because legends survive on clarity, on simple stories, on heroes that never need correction. And this Corvette complicated everything. They didn't lock it away because it failed. They locked it away because it worked, and told a story GM wasn't willing to let the world hear. What followed wasn't silence. It was influence without credit, and the effects would echo long after the car itself disappeared. But its fingerprints never did. After the project ended, subtle changes began appearing across later Corvette generations. Panel fit improved, interior rattles diminished, steering feel became more predictable, reliability complaints slowly declined. None of these shifts were advertised as philosophical changes, but together they marked a quiet departure from the past. Inside General Motors, the lessons traveled further than the Corvette program alone. Quality control processes tightened. Manufacturing discipline became a talking point. Long-term durability metrics started carrying more weight in decision meetings, but once focused almost entirely on performance figures. Japanese methodology was never credited, but it was absorbed. Engineers who had seen the secret project firsthand carried those standards with them. Tolerances, once dismissed as unnecessary, suddenly became achievable. Consistency became a goal rather than a coincidence. Enthusiasts noticed, even if they didn't know why. Later Corvettes felt more cohesive, more mature, less temperamental. Reviews began using words that rarely appeared in earlier decades: refined, confidence-inspiring, daily drivable. The car didn't lose its edge, but it gained composure. That composure had a source. The irony is that this invisible influence may have done more for the Corvette than a public release ever could have. By avoiding a direct confrontation with its own mythology, GM allowed the lessons to seep in slowly, without backlash. But that approach came at a cost, because without acknowledgement, the story was never corrected. The narrative never evolved. The Corvette improved, but its identity remained frozen in time. The answer may determine whether the Corvette continues adapting in silence or finally confronts the truth about how progress actually happens next time. The Japanese Corvette was never meant to change history. It was meant to protect it. What it ultimately revealed wasn't a flaw in engineering, but a flaw in pride. The car proved that performance could be refined without being diluted, and that discipline could elevate identity rather than erase it. But accepting that truth would have required General Motors to do something harder than building a better car. It would have required rewriting a legend. So the Japanese Corvette became a ghost, seen only by those inside the walls, felt only through changes that arrived quietly years later. Its influence lived on, even as its name vanished. In that sense, it didn't fail. It succeeded in the only way it was allowed to. This story isn't about a cancelled prototype. It's about fear. Fear that excellence coming from the outside might weaken the story told at home. Fear that admitting help would diminish greatness. And yet, the irony remains. The Corvette survived. It improved. It adapted. But somewhere in that progress is a version of the Corvette that never got to exist publicly. A car that challenged assumptions instead of confirming them. A reminder: threats to innovation aren't competitors.